Good morning, dear people. Darren Doherty here. Sort of a bit undressed. It's quite warm here today, and I just popped on what I had. So first at hand, as you can definitely see. So welcome, and I think I probably should be playing "Achy Breaky Heart" by Billy Ray Cyrus with this get up. So yeah. Anyway. So let's talk about fencing, and let's go to the presentation that I've prepared and had a bit of a toy with this morning to just get up to date. Hopefully everything's visible. I guess I've got to share the screen, don't I? So let's do that. And we're good to go because that's all I've got. Go live anyway. There we go. All right, let's do it. So let's pull this all over to there and go back to the start. All right, for the fencing discussion. Okay. So, here we are. Week 10, can you believe it? And pretty difficult topic to cover all of the aspects that people will probably want to look at, because there are so many variations in the styles of fencing, and I should say types of fencing, not styles of fencing, but types of fencing and designs and configurations and so on and so forth. So, and really depends on what you're trying to keep in and what you're trying to keep out, as to what you're looking to use and how high, and then you've got all of the engineering aspects of fencing and all of the rest of it, because ultimately it is a building of types, and it takes some engineering to decide how far apart posts will be, or what strength wires you will use, what thickness wires you will use if you're using wire, and so on. And then if you shift to using something like living fencing, what species will you use? Just yesterday I had a session with Benjamin Saleh in Somaliland, and all of the fences there are prickly acacia. In Morocco, where we spent a lot of time, a lot of the fencing is Ziziphus mauritiana, which is a really spiny jujube. So the Chinese red date, as it's known, or the jujube, beautiful fruit, is produced on a Ziziphus jujubea. So that genus produces a nice spiny plant, which also has some nice little fruit, which are sold on the side of the road by young boys. Yeah, so natural fencing is another thing. In Chile, there's they use a lot of prosopis around, which is a prosopis, or the mesquite species, genus, I should say, is used a lot in South America. That species is illegal in Australia. It's a prohibited plant, but it's got some genus which are not spiky, but most of them are. One of the reasons why it's prohibited in a lot of places. So there's a lot of different styles of species of living fence materials that people use and use today in very conventional agricultural systems. So it's not just something that's of a bygone era either. And a lot of people who do natural fencing will combine that natural fencing with a wire fence, with the understanding that the wire fence will be superseded by the living fence. I really love the idea of living fences because they're typically species which are spiny thicket type species, which are the ones that are usually used. They're also really good insectivorous bird habitat, and which is, we need a lot more of them, although we're running out of insects, it would seem. But nonetheless, those birds perform an amazing service to various agroecologies. So when we look at the landscape as we have on the screen, this is pretty well the last of the development layers. Outside of, you might say there's a bit of development in the energy layer, but this is the last of the development layers in the Regrarians platform. And we're seeing from when we started with this landscape, which was just a geographic base, to all of these layers being built up, we're looking at something like a finished landscape using all of these different parameters and materials and infrastructures all built into this as an aggregated whole. And that's where we get to. So will your landscape look like this? Probably not. It's a pretty well-developed landscape. There aren't too many agricultural landscapes at scale where people are able to achieve this in at least one lifetime, and that's where this often is looked at as a multi-generational product or project. So there we have it. So when we look at the policies or some of the prefaces, preambles for this particular layer, we look at a few. One is fencing to topography, and that's where we're looking at fencing following those, well, typically following the access and water layers. As we've shown in the last few weeks, quite a lot of the time when we're doing, when we're laying out, especially grazing properties, we're laying out roads and water lines following ridges, and then sometimes we're having roads go more on a horizontal alignment or more of a contour alignment with a gradient, and that road will also have within it, it'll be sort of be like a conduit, and it'll contain the forestry layer maybe, because it's got maybe an avenue of trees. It's got the water layer because it might have a pipeline or pipelines. It might have electricity within it and other services, so it's got the energy layer within it. But then it's also bounded, if you like, by it being a fence, so it becomes a laneway, and so on. So, and then those all joining up together become the subdivisions. So if you've got ridge, roads, and you've got roads which are following a contour alignment, if you put fences on each side of those roads, then you end up with some sort of parcel, which is typically going to fence a section or a whole primary land unit using keyline terminology. So there'll be that. There's always variations on that, and we'll explore some of those layouts, but that's what we're primarily looking at in terms of topographic positioning, or having the topography guide us as to where things go. The next thing is fencing to using electricity, and Harry Gallagher, Bill Gallagher was the real driving force of that of livestock fencing using electricity. Electricity had been used well before for security fencing, and in particular to keep humans out well before then. But it was Bill Gallagher who had bought a new car, I think in about 1938 or something, and the neighbour's horse came over to rub on it, and was rubbing itself as horses will do. So it found a new rubbing post, and he obviously wasn't too happy about a horse rubbing on his new car. So being a tinkerer, he went into his shed, and he got a motorcycle magneto, which is like a charger, and that created the spark and for his motorbike, and had a spare, so he fashioned that and connected it to the household electricity supply, and created this pulsing electric fence to keep his neighbour's horse away from his car. And of course it worked really well, and the rest is history. And his grandsons, as I understand it now, run the Gallagher Electric Fence and Gallagher Technology Company in Hamilton in New Zealand. So it's still a family company, and I think they would be the world's largest electric fencing company. So it's very effective. I think Joel Salatin said to me once that of the inventions of the 20th century, from his perspective, one of the most useful was the toothbrush, and if that was when it was, I don't know. And the other was electric fencing, because that combined with the insights of people like Andre Vassan and then ultimately people like Alan Savory and others, that those systems of grazing which enable us to mimic the close, dense grazing patterns and constantly moving grazing patterns of migratory livestock have enabled us to basically perform a service of biomimicry on the landscape by constantly moving these livestock herds, which are of a varying size and density. And we're able to adjust the time much easier with lower labour unit exposure and so on. And that the capital cost of fencing has reduced significantly as a result, because once upon a time when, and this is, as we'll talk about, once upon a time, all fencing was made of natural materials. And so it took a lot more effort, whether that be a hedge fence which you're making, or whether it's a fence that's made of wood that you've felled the tree and split the logs and laid it all up, or whether it's or whether latterly with the advent of wire fencing, and then particularly with the advent of barbed wire fencing, which sort of happened around the early 1870s, that you still needed to go and buy posts and dig holes and tamp the holes and tamp the strainers and all of that. And when you look around the landscapes where people have done that in the last couple of 100 years, a lot of those fences still exist, and you marvel at once as sort of look at it with awe, because there's so much effort that's gone into making these fences, when today, with the advent of electric fencing, our fences are almost invisible by comparison, and in a lot of ways more powerful than they were before. Barbed wire being an exception. I think the advent of barbed wire has possibly allowed the colonisation of areas both in Australia and in the United States. It was in the United States in about 1873, I think, that barbed wire was invented as a product, I think, in about 1830 or so. And it was either an Argentinian or a Frenchman. No one's really sure the actual inventor, but it was around about 1873 that the first barbed wire that was able to be made by a machine, not by hand, was able to be made. And that allowed the colonisation with cattle and other grazing animals of the west of basically everywhere west of the Mississippi in the United States up to the Rockies, and then of course in the Great Plains of Australia as well. In landscapes where, particularly on the Great Plains of the United States, there's no stone and there's no trees, or there's very few trees, and the trees that they do have are not necessarily durable for fencing materials. So the advent of that and the steel post enabled, with the advent of the railway line, allowed, and sort of supported, of course, by the US Army, allowed for those areas to be very, very quickly colonised and divided up. And you can immediately now set stock cattle and sheep on very, very vast areas with a relatively small amount of capital. And the same thing happened in places like Australia with the advent of that technology. We could go out, and barbed wire is still in use for that purpose today, on a continent scale here in Australia, for example, and certainly in the US. Although a lot of those areas of the US have started to turn their landscapes into cropping land, and that's to an extent happened here in Australia as well. The fences are being removed. So the next part of that is fencing, therefore, knowing that it's 1000 BC, that it's not 1000 BC, that it's 2019, and there's techniques and technology that's available to do things very differently to what we did way back when. So fencing styles I was looking at trying to categorize, which is as you've probably gathered by now, is one of the things that I'm prone to do, is to try and categorize things so that I can, within my own mindscape, try and rationalize the placement of things and the order of things. And I've came down with 5 fence styles, which is very much a play on words, because a style is a little device that you build to climb over a fence, so you don't have to damage or climb on a fence to get over it. You can climb over it, whereas an animal cannot. Maybe a goat can use it, or a very clever sheep. But a fence style, the fence styles are that we have perimeter fences. P.A. Yeomans infamously said that the only fence that most farmers get right is in its placement, is the perimeter fence. And I would have to question that, even so, because it was a surveyor who typically, well, in more recent times, in the last 200 years at least, would have placed that fence, that perimeter fence, that boundary to someone's property. And then there's yards and corrals. And the type, we talked about that last week, how we've originally had yards or corrals in buildings, and we've since, in the last few years, decided to shift that over into because we had it in buildings because they were so heavy, they were often connected with sheds and so on, and we thought, well, they are a fencing layer thing, and especially when I developed the fence style system, classification, I brought them over into here. And then we've got laneways, so the type of arteries that we set up on a farm, particularly when we've got livestock operations, but also too, a lot of people will, if they've got horticultural operations, also have laneways to simplify and organise access. And then we've got subdivision, which is, perimeter. The perimeter fence may well be is likely to be part of a subdivision fence, but then you've got a laneway which may subdivide, but then you've got the further subdivision, which may mean that you've got further fencing inside of all of the existing layers of fencing, which I will classify as subdivision. And then you've got perhaps the newest type of fence, which is, in a sense, the replacement for one of the longest term practices of humanity, which is shepherdry. And that's the temporary fence. And this is where, instead of having a dog and the constant presence of a human who himself typically has been who's been he's been as migratory as the herd that he's following around, that we use a similar practice, only we use temporary fencing, not dogs and humans, or the humans are there for a moment. A lot of properties have not got dogs now because of the changes in fencing technology, which in some ways is a little sad, because the whole human-dog connection, livestock connection is a really powerful one. But there's still a beating heart of people who are breeding really good dogs and training really good dogs, and it's particularly, I know here in Australia, and a lot of people who run sheep in particular on larger properties are still running dogs, because they're just incredibly useful, even where you've got all of this type of stuff, when you're trying to muster large numbers of animals. But then other people who follow different schools of thought with low stress animal handling, not to say that all dog systems are high stress, but there is some stress involved. With low stress animal handling, just don't want to have the dogs, so they don't. But there's all of that. Now, I've got on the screen a diagram which I've shown you before, which is way back when, I think in geography, when we were looking at land elements and how a landscape is broken up, and that when we look at this landscape that we see in front of us here, that we've got whoops, I'll just get rid of last time's drawing, that we've got all of these divisions in the landscape, and divisions based on slope change, and all of those, you might look at those and go, well, gee, they're very natural places in which we might place a fence because they're natural divisions in the landscape. So we're not just looking at subdivision positions which are completely aligned with our keyline layout. In the sort of broader layout, we might also coincide that with, and that keyline layout might do this as well, but coinciding that with land slope changes, because as I think we realise is that when you have common slopes, like this area, for example, right here, that slope is obviously going to have a similar land capability. It is going to have right across it, let's say if it's a little escarpment, that whole area there is going to have a similar land use capability. Similar here is going to have one, that one's going to have one, that's going to have one, right? And so on. So you've got all of these land use capabilities, and particularly, well, you know, a lot of our land use, for example, you might have in this zone here, all across this zone, that could have, because there's enough similarity between this system here and this one here, that you might have one whole land use in there. And so it's just going to be a matter of how far apart those two lines are as to whether you might further subdivide that, right? But because it's got a similar yield and similar attributes, you might just leave it as it is, leave it as one, right? But then when it comes into here, you'll go, gee, there's a lot of difference here. I might sneak this, like if you were going to subdivide, for example, if you were going to subdivide, say this in half across here, and you had that there, and then you've got that there, then you might look at this slope here and go, yeah, I might include that in there as well, so that that becomes part of this, and so on. There's a few nuances in that, but when it comes to being in here, you probably, if you had that, it's probably rock and escarpment and not much point being in there. So you'll just fence that off and then have the fence up the top here on the crest before it goes back down the other side and does whatever it does. So they're the sorts of things that we look at. Interesting, I can't recall whether I had this discussion with you prior, but one of the things that's sort of happened over the last few years in this space has been that best practice, and people get paid to do this, is to put a fence on either side of open depressions, you know, or flow lines as they're called. So some sort of fence which fences out the creeks and the flow lines, and that's pretty common practice around the world now, that people will subdivide that zone out so that livestock can't enter those areas. Now, there's been a bit of that's still, I would say, orthodoxy, to orthodox practice to do that. But what I would say has changed, including in my own practice, because I've, you know, as all of us will do, we'll follow some orthodox practices. But at the same time, I've over the journey, especially since I've started to work a lot more with holistic management grazing practices, I've looked at those zones as actually being something that we do want to access from time to time. So, you know, you might say in the first part of my career, I would do that and look at that zone as being somewhere where I might, because it's a flow line, there's lots of nutrient, I might plant trees in there, which I may well manage for timber production, as an example. But then over time, as I've learnt more about different practices, I've seen that actually it shouldn't be a matter that we actually exclude animals out of these systems. I mean, it's a classic case that overgrazing and poor cropping, cereal production, or poor annual crop production, and all of the cultivation of that is sped up the volume of water across the landscape, which has then been a cause, along with unregulated livestock access to those depressions, has caused a lot of erosion. So you put that together with soils which are losing their fertility, and you've got an erosion problem. And so the typical response has been by humans, policymakers, who in themselves often lack a holistic approach, is to try and, well, is to, instead of regulating regulating, instead of trying to suggest to people that their upland practices, that their watershed practices are actually speeding up water flow and causing this channelization. Or in the case, I think we've got Sophie on the call today. Yep, we have. Sophie's got a property with her father, and where we've got soil conservation practice, where we've got these swales or berms, terraces, which then slowly direct the overland runoff into a grassed valley, which is falling at 90 degrees to the contour, and that those valleys sometimes erode because of the poor practice that happens, the poor management practice that happens within those grassed valleys, and the declining fertility that they may have. So where we've got to with this as a result is that instead of having best practice that we fence, 5 meters or so, here's the landscape and here's the incision. And it's been, basically most farmers will put the post as close as they can to the edge of that terrace because they just don't want to lose land, right? Well, if you do that and don't sort things out, how many times have you been to farms where that post is now hanging by a thread of soil because the erosion processes have just kept on going, and the fence is sort of a talisman of the like a report card of the management that's gone on of that watershed, and how no one stopped sorting things out, and the little fence that's kept the creek, kept stock from having access to the creek, has not been its saviour. It's actually a lot more of a whole problem. So when we look at that, it's better that that if we're going to do this properly, I think, is that we actually treat this system as a paddock in itself. And so we've tended to come right out and go, maybe 20 or 30 metres away from the centre line or from the edge of the creek, so that you can actually use this as a paddock and then manage it with the pulses of grazing that we would otherwise. And then, of course, you may well have a period of exclusion where you try and get all of your trees and shrubs and all of those things that you should get going down in here, and all the willows or whatever's going, or whatever's appropriate, and let this system all get repaired, get all of its pondages back, and so on and so forth, and such that this becomes a really a conduit for wildlife and so on, as these systems are. And you get that sort of thing going, and then you've got your grasses in here. It gets to a point where if you put your animals in there for 1 or 2 days, they're not going to destroy everything. In fact, what they're going to do is they're going to be a source of regeneration. They're going to be that pulse of, as we'll talk about in the next week of our course, this being our last week until January, as we'll talk about in the soil section, we'll talk about the 5 ingredients for soil formation as defined by Dr. Christine Jones, and they are you need sunlight, air and water, you need biologically available minerals, you need living organisms on the soil and their byproducts, so living organisms on the surface and their byproducts. You need living organisms in the soil and their byproducts. But then you also need mosaic or intermittent and patchy disturbance regimes. And that's one of the big things that wasn't happening with this scenario, is that we weren't having any disturbance at all. And as a result, there was only trees growing, and maybe a few reeds and rushes, but there wasn't much else in a lot of cases, particularly as landscapes, if they're drier landscapes, those landscapes started to actually fall apart because they didn't have the whole suite of ecological inputs from different kingdoms of nature, from the animal kingdom, all of the kingdoms of nature, particularly the animal kingdom, to come in and give that pulse of disturbance and that pulse of fertility, which then lets these systems go. So and gives them a vitality which otherwise they're just not having because they're isolated from all of that. The only fauna that might happen is a bird coming and sitting there and pooping on a tree. That's about it. And those areas may well have been fenced out significantly enough that, say, wild or feral graziers might get in there and do so in an unmanaged fashion and overgraze it, and over we go. So there's a lot of reasons why I'm quite in favour now of us where we do have these systems that we do graze them from time to time. We do have that opening. So take your fences right out. That takes a lot of stress off as well. It may be that while you're, and this is the value of something like electric fencing, you may well initially put a fence in there to protect some of the plantings that you do. That might be a step that you take, but otherwise just depends on what sort of approach that you're looking at doing. But yeah, that's the kind of thing that we can do there. Anyway, I thought I'd go through that. Now, let's look at, let's move along. So let's look at perimeter. Dot off here, my desk will go. We've got a son who's landing soon. Our son Zane has been in Milan and Berlin modelling. He's a model, so for those of you who don't know, so he's been over there and he's just on the flight home now, and his mum's going to go and pick him up soon. So he must be on the Wi-Fi on the plane, as one can nowadays. So when I say fencing, knowing it's 2019, not 1000 BC, I've sort of made that point. But that's not to say that stone fences don't have a role. My friend Alan Yeomans said in his book, Priority 1, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone. And there's still a place for that, but it is that point. So when we look at perimeter fencing, one of the biggest discussions that we have on this front, particularly here in places like Australia, but also to an extent in places like the United States and others where, for a variety of reasons, there's increased pressure. And it's possibly because of population increases, and just the changing dynamic of rural land use, that in a lot of places we've got increased pressure or increased numbers of particular species of grazing fauna, of wild grazing fauna, or feral grazing fauna. So here in Australia, we had a very long problem for a long time with the European or Spanish rabbit, which was imported. 6 pairs were imported at Geelong Grammar, where I used to work, in about 1860. As part of the there was a society in Australia called the Acclimatisation Society, and Tim Lowe writes a lot about this society in his great book, The New Nature, where he's discussing and another book that he wrote called Feral Future, where he's looking at all of the species that people have intentionally imported into the new world. So, people brought rabbits and foxes out to Australia because they like to hunt. And of course, as a result of that, we've got, rabbits nearly ate the whole country out because they just saw Australia as one big Spain, and off they went. And it wasn't until we developed, put diseases, and really insidious and cruel diseases, upon them, that we were able to get much control of them. And, The reason why I've got an Akubra hat, and probably a few of you here have got Akubra hats, is because of those rabbits and people being ingenious with the use of rabbit pelts. And then the other the fox, of course, well, it's one of the biggest destroyers of Australian wildlife, so driving a lot of species to extinction. But then we've got kangaroos, and in other places we've got deer and other wild herbivores, and pigs. Wild pigs are becoming an increasing problem around the world, a wild boar. So there's a lot of things that we're trying to keep out, and then there's humans as well. And a lot of people spend a lot of effort and energy on trying to restrict access of humans to landscapes as well. So there's a range of different what are variously called, might be categorized as exclusion fences that are available now, or that there's designs of. And so there's a number of them that we've got on the screen here. So a fence like this is at a property that I've done work on, designed in Pennsylvania, Carversville Farm, and they put they've got a significant deer problem, deer pressure in that area. I mean, they're only half an hour out of Philadelphia, and there's just deer everywhere. And to try and manage a grazing plan or to grow vegetables as they do, I mean, I can't remember how many people they feed. They've got a foundation which feeds poor people. It's soup kitchens, sensational variety of really well-grown organic food on their farm. It's a really great operation. And they've got grazing lands, and they're doing meats and various meats and eggs and all of the rest of it. But to try and manage that so that it actually gets better, and that they can protect their primary enterprise, would be nigh on impossible with all of the mouths that always come to the better feast. I mean, that's one of the things that we've found so often, that when we've done our various improvements to properties and their fertility, there is so little fertility in the orthodox agricultural landscape that you only have to improve fertility a small amount, and you become the mecca for everything that can eat, and on it comes. And you go, where the hell did these come from? Well, you go, well, you just built it, and they will come. So that's an issue. And overgrazing, it doesn't matter what the mouth is. Overgrazing will occur if you've got uncontrolled herbivores on your landscape. So that's something that we've got to contend with. And it's a pity, because there's ways and means that we may well be able to deal with that otherwise. In large part, the regulatory climate makes it difficult for us, because we can't wild harvest and sell these animals that are they've got every right to be where they are. I don't, a kangaroo's got more right to be on a landscape than I have, or perhaps even a human has. They were here, when you talk about who was here first, they were here first. So, or deer or whatever. So I think they very much have a right, but just as we should have a right to have these animals, which are controlled and ostensibly therefore owned by the government, when they're protected species by the government. Well, the government should take responsibility for them in their regulation, and allow us to have a commercial outcome for them, and that would potentially reduce a huge amount of expense that a lot of farmers are having to make in terms of livestock fencing. It may mean that a lot of farmers actually do as the Aboriginals once did in this country, and Aboriginals in other countries, and harvest the wild animals instead of cultivating domesticated animals. I mean, there's all of these dynamics which come once you have the free access to manage a resource and then create an economy around it. But that's a whole other discussion, of course. So lots of configurations. Do you have aprons on the bottom of the fence? Do you have a floppy piece over the top? Actually, this is not from this is from the Condon group. I should just realised that Condon group, not ClipX. So the Condon group, I'll talk about a reference of theirs later. They're agricultural R&D organisation here in Australia, and they produce a lot of publications to show farmers about they're like the choice magazine of agriculture, and they show farmers about what are the best techniques. They've got a team of engineers who test things and all sorts of stuff. Really good organisation. Anyway, so the aprons to stop animals digging. A lot of animals that are a problem to us, their first choice will be to try and go under a fence. So one of the things that I will commonly do where I've got that as being the case is that I will put a barbed wire, a big heavy barbed wire about 50 millimetres under from the base of the fence, so just above where it'll all get potentially rusty and whatnot. Put that there as a first step before before going straight for the apron, depending on what I'm trying to keep out. If it's kangaroos and wallabies and wombats and things like that, or deer, often you don't need to put an apron down. It's when you've got things like foxes and when you've got things like, things that are a bit more able to burrow. Wombats will ultimately, but not in a hurry. But if you put a barb on there, then I know it's not rice, but it's the first thing that they'll get a memory of as far as the fence is concerned. Now, other people might look at doing outriggers. Outriggers are good with an electric fence, and I like that. Some people, what they'll do with their outriggers is they may actually put, instead of putting an apron like as here, they'll put another fence, which is a short fence, which might only be a metre or something high, and it might be it's out here, and it carries a wire outside of the fence. So you've got two fences in effect. And that means that if an animal comes along to here, then that's its first contact. And if it's going to try and jump it, now it's going to jump that much higher, and it's likely to get it, that's going to be its first memory. So there's that. That can be a problem, though, of course, with vegetation growing up into it. And then you've got all of the issues of shorting, etc. But then that comes down to whether you're in a brittle land. I mean, this landscape here, which is very non-brittle, not much everything will grow over this fence ultimately. There'll be vines that grow over. It'll basically be a trellis in the landscape. It's been built that heavy, understanding that. So whereas here in the deserts or dry arid lands of Australia and other arid lands of the world, if you clear the soil off the fence, which a lot of people do, and that's another discussion as far as erosion potential and so on, but a lot of people will clear their fence lines because they're a perimeter, they're fire breaks, there's all of these other reasons, and so that you can maintain what is an integral part of your operations infrastructure, so that you can maintain it. They'll often keep a cleared access on either side and sacrifice that. Or, as a lot of our clients will do, they'll clear that, and then we'll try and get a herd of animals on there so that we can get a bit of grass growing on there. But because it's compacted and all the rest of it, you won't get a huge amount, but we get enough grass on there so that we at least get landscape function along this strip. Whatever the case, that grass, if you've got electric wires down the bottom, then you have the potential that you'll get shortages where the grass, especially when it's green, comes into contact with that. It can also be a fire risk if you've got enough energy running through that wire and you've got grass. So sometimes you can get an arc, things happen, and away it goes. So there's those sorts of things to consider with these different fences. These are a really good opportunity as well to look at living fence opportunities. So if you owned both sides of this in particular, or you've got one side, you might well look at planting a living fence along here as a succession to this, and as a greater barrier. And also, a lot of people really don't like the look of fences. I'm observing that more and more with different clients over the time and people. And so putting some sort of shelter belt or perimeter planting along here is another thing that a lot of people will do, so that you'll have a line of trees which will be going along here, and then another line of trees that will go along here, and so on. And that, you might have a shrub here. And doing that sort of thing can really soften the effect, but also if you put the right species in, can be a fire break as well. You can also, we commonly will plant species like casuarinas along a fence line for the very fact that their needle drop is so intense and so silica rich, excuse me, that basically suppresses all grass growth, even in quite in quite a few non-brittle places that we've worked where if you didn't, then the grass would be growing up the fence. So there's a variety of different approaches that you can combine right on that edge, on that interface. One of the, let's get back to here. Sorry. One of the, there's not, I wouldn't say there's been too much innovation in the hard fencing space over the last, really, 100-odd years. The big leap forwards have been the development of prefabricated wire, the different types of meshes that are available, like you see here, where you've got a whole lot of wires, which are the vertical and horizontal wires, have all been joined together using a variety of knots through mechanical processes. So you can get a big roll of quite a lot of prefabricated fencing, right up to sort of 1.9 meters, and you can change. I mean, I did one at our place, and I was able to, because I bought enough of it, I was able to actually specify the actual spacings of the wires. So I've got 17 wires. At the bottom, the wires are actually of a smaller spacing, gradation of spacing. But as you get up, then the spacing comes to the same spacing and so on, because of the particular types of animals that I was trying to keep out and the influence of the animals that were within, potentially. So that's been an innovation. In terms of posts, there's really two types of steel post in the world. In the United States, North America, there's what's called the T-post. And the T-post, if you look at it from above, a plan view, it basically looks like that. And it's got on the back of it a series of notches into which, so if you look at the back of a T-post, you've got all of these notches built in, and they kind of function in the same way as the other kind of post, which I think was developed in Europe, because I've seen a lot of them there as well, is this star picket, as we call them here in Australia, or it's more of a Y post. And they've got their holes here, as you can see. So you've got the holes here. Instead of a notch, they've got a hole. So with this one here, if you've got wire running past it, then you've got to use another small piece of wire to tie that on. So you've got to do a little knot around there, and then that's got to go around here, and then you've got to do another knot there, sort of tie it in place. Otherwise, the wire would just come off. This is the only real big innovation leap forward, but it was developed by the Clipex company here in Australia, and they sort of turned this Y post into somewhat of a coat hanger. So this little piece here, this flat piece here, which is shaped like this, right? It moves up and down in this direction. And so what you can do is you can push this, and off that pivot, it will move forward. So it actually goes around like that, around that rivet there. So that's the hinge, and this is sort of a regulator. So that moves. So as you push the wire forward, then this goes back, and this little piece comes forward, and that creates the opening into which you can then put the wire. So that saves an enormous amount of time, something like 80 or 90% of the time it would otherwise take to fix wire to a fence. Because, if it's this type of fencing here, well, obviously you can't put that through a hole, so you've got to actually link that up like here with a short piece of wire. So with every few rungs, you've got to come in and tyre wire on here and tyre wire on here, which is all okay, but it's time is money, and who wants to spend that much time fencing? Although a lot of livestock producers, I would say, their profession, if you looked at their time, they spend more time fencing than they do managing pretty well anything else on their operations. So they're fencers as a profession. So so you can spend a lot less time doing that. Which and labour, when you look at breaking down the cost of fencing, posts and labour are by far the biggest component cost typically. If you're doing prefabricated wire, then sometimes that can compete. But if it's plain wire or electric wire, wire is by far the cheapest component in the whole cost of a fence. It's labour and it's posts that cost the money here. So if you're looking at it as a proportion of the total. So having innovations like that, like this, if you're going to do this type of fencing, is really worthwhile looking at. Other companies, there's another company here in Australia which have been historically the biggest supplier of these posts, and in other parts of the world that they are called by that name. Like in New Zealand, the Y or star picket is called a Waratah post or a cyclone post because they're made by the Waratah company. And they have innovated to make a new geo clip, which is a sort of, it's not like this. You still have to use a wire fastener, but they've prefabricated those, so they're almost as quick as using the Clip-X, right? But you have to buy the special posts to do that. So anyway, they're the sorts of things that people are doing. There's not much else that's really that innovative that I've come across in this space when it comes to these sorts of hard fencing materials. Let's look at yards and corrals. So probably, as I mentioned, I think last week when we were talking about buildings, the two biggest figures in the low stress animal handling space are Dr. Temple Grandin, who's on the screen here, who's a genius professor from the southwest of the US, and I think she's a professor at A&M, Texas A&M, I think, but I could be wrong there. It's not important, but she's been immortalised, you might say, on the screen with a movie which I highly recommend, which is called I think it's just called Temple, and Claire Danes does a magnificent job portraying her. And it's great because it captures the moments of insight, which are always, it's very, very rare that you'll meet or that you'll see people who have true original insight. And Temple Grandin, with her capabilities as an autistic woman, excuse me, with her capabilities and ways of seeing the world as an autistic person, has been able to have the rest of us, through that insight, manage the livestock that we utilise and benefit from in a whole different way. And people like Bud Williams are similar, although his operations are more, well, they're similar but different. But there's certainly a lot of alignment between the two philosophies and practices. Excuse me again. You probably noticed that around this time this happens, and it's a few reasons. I've probably got, as most people have got, an allergy to the food, to the disgustingly small array of foods that we put inside of ourselves and that we enjoy. And secondly, we've been doing a lot of landscaping this is my eldest daughter's property, and her partner, Dre, so Isabella and Dre's place, and we've been doing a lot of landscaping. So there's actually a lot of bare soil here, and we had a 37-degree day here yesterday, Celsius, and so there's quite a lot of dust. So I've been spending a fair bit of time sweeping. You certainly wash your feet before you go to bed nice white sheets. Anyway, so Temple has done a lot of work, and I've credited ProWay here, for example. So ProWay is a company here in Australia that designs yards, and I should just mention that if you want to look at their yard designs, have a look at the Regrarians platform resources drive, and if you go to the fencing section there, there's quite a bit of stuff in there, but if you want, just go to the yards section or folder, and you'll see a whole range of different. So if you need a design for your big outback station where you've got nearly 700 cattle that you're working inside of a set of yards, well then there's a design. They stopped a few years ago having their designs online, I think probably because people started to copy them and just make them themselves. And it's certainly the case that a lot of people have done exactly that. But of course, it's always important to honour who's originated these things. But anyway, so when we look at the concepts of where you place yourself is something that these people, Temple and Bud and so on, have helped us to be. So a lot of people, I grew up going to sale yards all of the time, and all of the noise and the electric prodders and the different versions of different, people would have, you sort of, as a child in particular, I would know people by the brand of electric prodder that they would have, or the agents, helpers who, the roustabouts or whatnot, who would have, some would have a wooden stick, some would have a plastic pipe, and so on, all for the purpose of abusing animals, ultimately, because the yard designs at the sale yards were just not set up to be low-stress places. And there's a lot of theatre, and, it was always, you were raised to understand that these are dangerous places. And that's not to say that yards become safe all of a sudden because they're a Temple Grandin design facility. You've still got very large megafauna, which are, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times heavier than you are, and are very powerful. So if you get yourself in the wrong place, and sometimes they have horns and stuff, so if you put yourself in the wrong place, well, then that might be the end of it all. So, you've got to pay the respect. But those old style yards, there's a lot of theatre that's going on. It's a very angry place. There's a lot of people whose characters are shown out, and their frustrations are shown out through their various outbursts of cruelty quite often. So a lot of that is built, but a lot of it too is actually people coming back into themselves, having enough understanding of and enough training, retraining, if you like, of how to actually position yourself and how to understand how the animal sees, because how the animal sees is very, very different to how we see. And so you can't, and that's one of Temple's great insights, is seeing the world through another's eyes. And I think that's one of the gifts, if you like, of autism, is extraordinary empathy, perhaps painfully extraordinary empathy for some. But some people, like Temple, have been able to turn that empathy into insight, and that's very powerful. But that's really important, to be able to position yourself in a really good way. The other thing is that when we look at that in the context of when we are concentrating animals, is to try and do it in a way which is made, where the materials that you're using are soft, because a lot of the time when animals are coming into these places, it's part of the last journey, right? So, and of course, you've got to look at it and say, all right, well, if I've got yards and I'm getting bruised and they cause bruising and all of that sort of stuff, and then that animal goes and gets slaughtered, well, then it's going to have not only does the animal get slaughtered, but also it has the ignominy of being downgraded as a carcass because your handling facilities or the handling facilities at the abattoir itself or slaughterhouse itself may not be very gentle. I think Jeff or Michelle are on the call this morning. I mean, I know that one of the reasons why they set up their own mobile on-farm abattoir is because I think it was Jeff went to a abattoir one day that was processing his chickens, and he hung around and someone kicked his chickens. It's like, really? And I've known this, I mean, a lot of you will have seen various reports, often by animal activists, and good on them, I think, for shining a light on bad practice, because a lot, not just animal activists were appalled by some of these behaviours, it was producers as well. And this is one of the things that a lot of people don't realise as animal activists, is that some of the loudest and most upset voices are the producers themselves, because they love their animals. I mean, that's they have, you're not a cattle person because you hate cattle. You're a cattle person or a sheep person or a chicken person because you're actually you have an affinity, you might say a form of love for those animals themselves as individuals and as a species. So or as breeds. So, it's not like you're doing this as a drone. You're doing this because it's part of your expression of your life. And so when you see animals being treated cruelly, especially at that really important moment where we're actually taking their lives, or it's part of the process that leads up to us taking their lives, then that's very distressing to people, because it's already a stressful experience for people. I personally, when I've killed animals with a knife or with a gun, or on farm animals I'm talking about, when I've done that, you don't do it with, it's not something that is done with enjoyment. It's done with appreciation, I would say. Well, at least that's the emotion I feel. There's trepidation every time, and I think if you get to the point where you don't have that, and that's been one of the discussion pieces that a lot of people have had around the value of having on-farm processing facilities or smaller scale facilities, is that they only run a few days a week, and so you don't have this industrialization of the human themselves to the point where you become the killing guy. I was reading recently somewhere, I can't remember where, but there was a facility that I was reading about where they were using a blunt tool, something like a sort of an axe of sorts, and that was how in that abattoir they killed. And they had a stat on, and there was a guy whose job was to do that. He's kind of like the executioner from the medieval times, and how many animals he was processed. So what's the psychological effect on a human of doing that day in, day out for 40 years of their life? Just the same as what's the psychological effect and the physiological effect of being a low-paid worker in a large industrial facility where you just, you might have a bit of rotation, but you more or less do the same job day in, day out without a break from that. I mean, that cannot be good on the psychology of people, and that's why there's such a high turnover of people who are working in these. Or it's the sort of, if you don't get an education, or you've not been able to raise yourself up, for want of a better term, in other words, that you've not been able to do that, well, then often you'll find yourself working in the slaughterhouse in a lot of these rural towns, because that's the last place that's left. So, there's a lot of arguments, and we sort of had some of that discussion last week for why and how we should do this better. My friend Tom Bradman, who's been a friend and client and student and all the rest of it for a number of years, 12 years or so, when he designed his yards, he used some matchsticks. So, these are visual aids which help people to determine how a layout might be. I think it's really important that if you've got yards, have a look around and stuff. Look at the temple ground and sort of um, designs that are in those ProWay templates, but then look at your own circumstances and what you've observed yourself, and think about the materials that you're going to use. You're going to use the materials off your own farm and so on. So my old friend and client Rob Laurie, who's just sold this property to a new client who he introduced me to, he built his own yards. I think he looked at some of the Temple Grandin books and took inspiration from them. And you see all of this black stuff here in the middle. It's all through there. That's all conveyor belt. And there's a little bit of that here. See where there's in this chute where the animals are really coming down and they're being forced into this really small area here. When you get that kind of thing, it's in order for you to be able to appear and therefore move a number of animals or individuals into an area, well then, and do that in a way which is soft on them. Rob's lined all of this with old conveyor belt. And there's a place just up the road that's got it for sale on the side of the road all the time. And I look around and no one around this area has got yards which have got conveyor that are lined with conveyor belt. It's very, very soft on the animal, but it also means that you can hop down and be low so the animal can't see you, and then you can pop yourself into a position where you are adjusting your position in relationship to the animal, and therefore, if you want the animals to go forward, well then don't stand in front of them, move behind them. So if they're in that zone there, then move to the back of them, bob down, move around to the back, appear at the back so that their eyesight can see out the side, and they'll see you at the back here, and then they'll move forward. But if you're standing here, then you've got no chance of them going to there unless you send a dog or go up there and start prodding them and all the rest of it, making noise and being stressful. Laneways. When we look at laneways, there's a lot of, I haven't credited this one, but because I got this late at night and I neglected to get the credit, so I'll have to go and find it at some stage. But there's an array of different subdivision layouts, which then have laneways within them. And here are a few that are, or two at least, that are featured. And I like this diagram for a few reasons. One, because I really like equal area comparisons. So and how one can look at the different levels of material use, and then just quantify in some sort of fashion, whether it's in a tabled index, which we've talked about before, like the species index we looked in forestry and otherwise, where you've got some sort of comparative table or process where you can look at a situation and then evaluate the various benefits or otherwise of that particular layout or scheme or whatever else you're looking to put in. Because a fencing system, even though it's relatively low on the scale of permanence, it is still a very permanent piece of infrastructure. So as it is infrastructure. And so there's a variety of different ways in which we can integrate, which is usually the integration that we have, integrate a piped water supply and a fencing system. And so here we see, for example, on this one here, we've got a water point right here. So we've got a water point here, and you might say, well, there's the access line. And so the access line allows animals to come up and access this water point by, if these are all fenced off, that we just have to open the gate on one, and then that means that they can come up, and then when we close that, we open this one and they can close up. So you keep all of the gates closed, and they can all walk backwards and forwards to the water point, right? So a lot of manure in the alley, of course, and I would say as well as that there's going to be a lot of disturbance in the alleys or the laneway. Good grazing because of the shapes and so on, because you'll be able to pretty well manage the type of grazing operation that you have in there, and so on. And it's a low labour cost and not a huge amount of fencing. So we've got 4 miles of cross fence in this system. This is one that I do quite a lot, but what we may do as a variation in this is just have a perimeter fence where we've got a central laneway. So I will do. There's a variation on here which is not listed. That is where, like for us, we will have this central laneway, which may well be on a ridge or following a contour alignment. And what we'll have there, instead of having a fixed trough position, which you can go to, which is certainly can, but you just get a lot more damage to the alley, is that you'll have a pipeline which will run along along one of these fence lines, and then from that you will then, if these are fenced off, that you will have a water trough which is placed underneath one of these fences. And you might, if the animals are, let's say there's a temporary fence running across there, that this fence tomorrow might be shifted, say, to here. And so instead of this being a permanent fence system, all of these white lines, the permanent setup here is the laneway. The permanent system is the pipeline with its series of hydrants. And then the temporary system is the fencing, and the trough position. So you're constantly moving those. So instead of having fencing everywhere, you've just got your laneways. And that's something I favour where possible, because it's a low infrastructure cost, and it allows us to absolutely have maximum flexibility of grazing areas according to the number of animals that we have in an area, or in the type of livestock that we have, right down to the amount of area that we will want to have those animals in for the particular condition that they're in at any given time, and the condition of the grassland. So trying to get it so that you can shrink and swell these grazing areas for that reason. So that's something I favour, and it would be interesting for me, which we will do. I know we are doing in the fencing chapter. We're doing a comparative analysis between all of these, where we look at this a bit more thoroughly, and there'll be a couple more examples. We haven't got there yet. There's a diagram, otherwise I'd have it in here. So, and then you've got this water truck method, and the water truck method is where you're basically, you're divvying up this area, and then you're using a truck with a portable trough, which is what some people do. Then there's the pipeline method, and the pipeline method is, and this is considering, because in this space, the innovation that is least orthodox in this space is portable water supplies, or portable water troughs. There's a few reasons for that. As I've mentioned before, there are variations on this which are quite interesting. There's a slideshow which I took an iPhone video of at a conference I did earlier this year, the Cherub conference, which they gave me this cup for being a speaker, as well as some cash and a bottle of wine. Leanne and Barry O'Sullivan. So I think it might be in the soils section of the workplace. Anyway, I did a video of their talk, and I've got to go back and look at it again, because they are running something like 3,000 or 4,000 animals in one herd in a system that's not that different to this here, where they've got an extensive property, I think about 30,000 hectares, in that sort of range. And so they've set their property up so they have laneways, and in the laneways they have portable water supply, but they have one pipe, which I can't remember the size of. That's maroon. I've got to go back and have a look at it. But they went through and did all of that, and normally, and they broke the kind of cardinal rule here of water supply, that you're meant to supply all of your animals within a 4-hour period. They sort of said, no, the animals take care of it themselves, which I thought, because I looked at their trough size and their water pipe diameter and all of that, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. Look, the proof's in the pudding, and they are doing what they're doing, and they're doing it very successfully, and they're getting outstanding outcomes on a whole range of different metrics. I don't know. I suppose, like a lot of us, even though you see something that works, you still stick to what you know. You don't want to be the one, especially when you're in the when you've got the consultant hat on. You don't want to be that person that recommends something that definitely doesn't work or won't work. So, I follow a more conservative route, but that's part of the consideration there. So a lot of these systems are considering not portable troughs as best practice. They're considering a fixed concrete trough as being best practice. And I know that that's the case. I mean, I've had projects that have been funded in places like the United States where we've not been able to get portable troughs funded because the government just doesn't recognise them as best practice technology. So we've actually had to install fixed troughs using all of this public money. And then because my clients know that that's not best practice, it's so much better to use a portable trough. They've got all of this sort of fixed cost, this fixed infrastructure, which is never going to be used in the landscape, while they go around and use the better design. And I've had those discussions with the government, but you'd have to go to Washington and spend 3 years or something to talk to some idiot to get it all working. I'd say that with all due respect. Anyway, so here we've got a water pipeline which is in this sort of shape, and that sort of shape is then got the paddocks, and the animals in each of these have access to that. There's the system of PV which is Pastorea Versan, which is quite popular, more popular in Latin America than holistic management is. And that's the kind of method that they use. Good, high cap. Well, I said to them when I saw their systems, I went, wow, because a lot of people who do Pastorea Versan came to our Rex courses or Rexy courses earlier in the year, probably about 50 people managing tens of thousands of hectares, if not more, probably 100,000 hectares using that method. And their whole, I call it the little boxes, because it's just a series of laneways. And it's kind of a combo of this layout and this layout, where you've got laneways, and then you've got a series of, there's a trough in either that's accessible by a number of paddocks at once, or there's a trough in every equal area paddock, and it's all hardwire fencing and so on. And I was surprised in a lot of ways that a lot of these characters came along, because they were doing really well, and with Latin American labour costs, because that was what I was looking at. I was horrified at the potential cost of this fencing infrastructure. They said, no, it's only this. I went, oh, right, okay. Because you don't, I mean, here in Australia, where labour's so expensive, you look at things like that and immediately just go, wow, how much labour did that cost you? And their labour costs are quite low. So even so they were coming along because to the Rexy, and a lot of them were actually looking to completely remove all of this fence. They had such profitable operations that they could do that they had the potential that they could, even though they had something that was working so much better than everybody else around them who's just doing the old set stocking route, that they had so much, their businesses were so much better that they had the outlook to say, I'm going to take all of this out and I'm going to go to the new system, which is really, really interesting as a psychology in itself. So that was fascinating, and that they were prepared because they could just see that that they'd be able to get that next leap up in yield. But these are professionals who are always looking at doing professional development and all of the rest of it, and being the best that they can be. Partly, I suppose, there's a bit of, I suppose, in some cultures, there's like here in Australia, people don't try and out-brag each other as to necessarily or publicly, unless there's a lot of drinking involved, on how much better a livestock producer they are than someone else. They don't do that. It's not a familiar cultural practice. Whereas in Latin America, culturally, that's done all of the time. Everyone thinks that they are the best rancher. That's great, but they tell everybody about that. So, and that's quite a difference. And so that societal practice also then means you have to back that up. So, and in backing that up, that means education and all of that sort of thing. So that's an interesting observation. Well, for me, it's an interesting observation in the psychological processes, or the socio-psychological processes that some communities of humans put themselves through. This one here, I don't know who developed this. As far as I understand it, it came out of holistic management, and it's called most people call it the wagon wheel, because it looks like a wagon wheel. And a lot of places have done this. So if you read The Call of the Reed Warbler by Charlie Massey, whose daughter Tanya is now on the workplace, which is not, Charlie's not a big web guy. But anyway, the process in the Reed Warbler, which is more or less a series of case studies of different fencing systems, of different regenerative agricultural systems around the world, but particularly in Australia. A lot of the larger rangeland scale holistic management projects or ranching or grazing for profit type projects use the wagon wheel system, because it was the cheapest way of being on very large landscapes, of being able to fence them and have the minimum number of water points. And so you've got a water point in the middle, and that water point has you either with you've got a perimeter fence, so you've got these large cells, and that distance from here to here is no more than 2 kilometres, because it's been determined that once you have animals have to walk more than 2 kilometres to go and drink, well, then their condition starts to decline. So that's kind of what the optimum is. So you might have these 4 kilometre squares, 4 kilometres by 4 kilometres, with a trough in the middle, which is often then connected to a pipeline grid, which then connects to the next one and to the next one. And you can look on aerial photos at a whole range of different properties that Charlie Massey did case studies on in the Reed Warbler, and you can see these operations in practice. So it's kind of been superseded a bit as a method. Again, if you look at what Leanne and Barry O'Sullivan have done, they've got the same sort of perimeter setup, but they've gone with a portable water trough. See, back then, a lot of the time people were using artesian bores and artesian water, but also using steel pipelines. So again, it sort of comes back to, if you're building a stone fence or you're building a wood fence where you harvest the wood, then you tend to not follow the contour. You tend to use the minimum amount of materials possible. And the same goes for when you're doing steel fencing, steel pipe work. It's obviously very expensive. And so you have the kind of grid that fits with that. And so with that, there's been I wouldn't say a huge shift, but there's been a bit of a shift to this type of setup, where like the O'Sullivans, where they've got the pipeline. They don't have the centralized point. They have a series of hydrants and takeoffs inside of that. All of that is inside of a laneway, which goes, down along the middle. And then off that, so you've got a perimeter fence. And then off that, they simply then use a temporary fence that the animal, and then I'll say if they've got the trough here, because they're fairly big troughs, they might put a fence here so the animals can go in and out back to the paddock, and then they go forward and so on. So yeah, there's a variety of ways that people can do that. There's only a couple of ways that people can do this on these extensive areas. They can either do this or do that. Or, as some people are now moving towards, use shepherds again. That's a whole other discussion. Okay, well, let's move along. So this is a job I did in 1996, 1997 with the late Andrew Schneider, who unfortunately passed as a man in his late 20s, early 30s, lovely fellow. Anyway, he had very big plans for this place, which included us and our plan that we did with him. So here's that landscape as it stands, and you can see there's a few fences, there's a few dams, the usual, at least in Australia and a lot of places, a dam in every paddock. So instead of having a portable water supply, you build a dam in the paddock, somewhere at the bottom of it usually. So the paddock is a catchment. You put a fence around it, you put your animals in there, and when you need to get the animals down, in this case to the shearing shed, it's a sheep property, down to here, well, you've got no laneway to do so. You get dogs and you make noise, and you sort of wake up going, oh, what's mustering day today? And it's like, it's a big event in your life, as opposed to having a laneway where it's not as big an event because you open the gate and then the animals just walk to where they're going, more or less. I'm simplifying, but that's how it more or less works. It's a big difference in approach. So what we did here, we found more or less this is a quite an interesting landscape. It's a karst landscape. It's karst, K-A-R-S-T, so it's a limestone landscape. All of these lakes in a semi-arid zone in southwestern Victoria, here in Australia. And a beautiful grazing country, and pretty sparsely vegetated, heavily cleared. But he had a topographic line which more or less went through the centre. You can see there's a main ridge which runs through here, and then there was somewhat of a primary ridge which ran through and off that down through here. As you can see, these are 10-metre contours, so there's not much undulation in it. Back in the day when we didn't have much else available, which is only, 22 years ago. Anyway, put the laneway in with a pipeline, which was fed from this highest point of the property. So, my designs haven't changed much, as you can see. And a couple of, this is a block of Tagessästi. It's a high sandy ridge. Shouldn't have much other value, so we put a block of Tagessästi in. He wanted to have a cut flower operation over here. We did some alleys and, a few different bibs and bobs. All it got, before he died, we're going to do alley farming here with saltbush and so on, 17 kilometres of planting rows. There you go. So Sophie, I did that way back when. We never got to do all of this because he died. I think what he did get done was the laneway, and that was a really big success. And some of the initial further subdivision because of the water pipeline that we had. And secondly was the other thing that we did was we built this dam. And I know that the people who are cousins of another family I know out that way who bought that, and they love that dam. It's a really good dam. So it's a floodplain dam, and I think I described that kind of dam when we did the water session. But that's a way of doing that. So we'll have a look at a bit more of that sort of thing when we get along here with subdivision. So as I said, subdivision is a lot of what we do when we do, like if we fence out the waterways and if we fence out, you've got perimeter fence, you've got laneway, and then you know, in terms of if you look at the automatic places to put fences in a livestock property are typically, you'll believe me, there's a lot of value in putting a laneway in, and then you fence out perhaps then you'll fence out maybe your flow lines, as we discussed. In this particular property, where we've made those automated decisions about where to put fencing, like I said, we've made all of these into effective paddocks by spreading them out. I think I did this one about 10 years ago or so. And that then immediately created the subdivision. So as soon as we put in the laneway, as soon as we put in the flow lines, that somewhat exclusion fencing, then that immediately made a number of paddocks automatically, without having to then do further subdivision. One of the caveats on that, and what that is different, I suppose, is, and I've looked at this, I think, on other jobs that we've looked at, is this distance that we have between, say between here and here. What's that distance between there and there? So if we are doing any temporary fencing to temporarily subdivide these paddocks further, is how much wire can we carry on one of these things? So these will carry, and these are a primary tool in portable grazing or temporary grazing system, is the wire reel, and it will carry between 300 and 400 meters of tape, or in this case, a braided aluminium cable from a company called Nemtech, who a few clients had pretty good success with as an experiment. I've got one of them that's just written to me, so I'll have to check in and see how that's still going, if it's still using it. You know, it was a product that I found, and I recommended I said, here's a new product as an alternative to using poly tape, which is what everyone uses generally. And these people were particularly uneasy about increasing the plastic pollution that already exists on this planet, and all of those microfibers which are going to wear off and pollute a paddock, pollute a wool clip, or just pollute when we use this polywire fencing. So I saw this Nemtech braided aluminium fencing as being somewhat of an alternative to that. Anyway, still searching for it's always the case, what's the best product that's going to work really, really well. Being braided aluminium, as an aluminium cable. See, the Polyface they use on their reels, they use aluminium wire. And aluminium wire, or aluminum wire, is not strong. It's not very malleable. So you only have to bend it a few times before it breaks. And it's not strong. So if an animal, for whatever reason, attacks the wire, then it doesn't have a high tensile strength. And I had when we had Joel out here in Australia and other places, and people were, he was talking about all the stuff that he uses and blah blah. He said, I use aluminum wire everywhere, and both my fence wires and all my internal fence wires and all of my cross fencing is all aluminum and blah blah blah. And we had quite a number of people on the internet who had been to Polyface or had followed their advice, or had been in past interns or whatever, apprentices, and they weren't using aluminium wire because they were talking about it. So I thought, okay, well, that's all reasonable. It's important to hear everyone's feedback. And I came across this company, Nemtech, for I don't know what reason, but anyway, they make energizers. They're a South African company, and they make energizers and a few other bits and pieces. And we found that they had this braided cable, and so we gave that a go, and it seemed pretty good. The great advantage of aluminium is that it is superconductive, so as an electricity wire. So, and having a higher level of conductivity means that the power of the energy that your energizer produces, as it goes along the fence, it goes further. So, so if you've got wire that has more conductivity, it's like having a bigger pipe with less friction loss. And there's a lot of, I often think of electric fencing just for my own internal workings. I often think of electric fencing like I do with plumbing, a landscape. So, you know, you have energizers, which are effectively pumps, and they produce voltage, which is akin to pressure. And then you've got ohms of energy, which are effectively the flow rate. And so if you look at it in that fashion, and every time you put an outlet on, like another fence line, or a branch touches it, or a leaf touches it, or something touches the fence, well, that's akin to you having more outlets on the fence, and that reduces not only the voltage, the pressure, but it also reduces the flow rate, the ohms of energy, the joules of energy that are going through it. You get a lot more resistance in the fence. So these are all things to contend with as we try and work with what is ultimately a psychological barrier. But the distances that we have between our subdivisions need to be guided by the equipment that we're practically using, but also the size of the herds that we're using. Because let's say that we were going to graze down this landscape, so we were going to have a fence which went down here, and that was a grazing cell, and the animals were in there. Well, let's say that we've only got 30 animals on our farm for whatever reason, and we're trying to do management intensive and high density grazing. Well, then if that's 300 metres long and you've only got that sort of carrying capacity or stocking rate for the whole farm, well, then that might mean that that's only bloody metre wide, 300 metres by 1 metre. And that's not ideal, obviously, for livestock to be in. It's just a 1 metre wide, a cow is 2 metres long, more or less, so 2 square metres. So you've got to accommodate that. So that's where you might, if that were the case, you might therefore create a further subdivision, which you can split that parcel to, and then you can create a squarer grazing area and so on. One of the things, and I don't know that I've mentioned this before, and this is highlighted here, there's a few different ways in which to put water into paddocks as well. Like I'd expect, I can't recall this now, but I'd expect that I'd probably put a temporary wire out here along that pipeline, and then I would have a subdivision which might run down like that with the temporaries, and then I'd pull all of that down to go to the next thing. And that's something that you might well do, say, over here. If that was, let's say that was 300, and you'd look at that originally, or more than 300, then you might put a further subdivision, say, through to here, which you'd break up. You'd then just have to deal with the water somehow. You might have to put another water line down there or work that out somehow. But then you break that up like so, in that sort of fashion. But that may all be temporary, because what we've got now is such good temporary systems. Whether it's, pigtails, this is the kind of poorest example of a temporary system, or one of the poorer systems. There's really, as we'll talk about, there's much, much faster systems, which mean then that instead of you having the capital cost and the worry and the maintenance and all that goes on of fencing the whole property, and this comes down to even the internal subdivision. I know people who on some properties, they do all of this. The only fence that they have that's permanent is the perimeter, and they go out with their Kiwi Tech on the motorbike and they fence all of this out quite quickly as an exercise, and with up to a 3-wire fence, and set all of that up when they're going to be in this area, and that takes an hour or something to do that. And they look at it in terms of the sum cost of their labour rate and the portable infrastructure of them putting it up, putting it down, versus the capital cost of putting in all of that fence and then replacing it over time and maintaining it and doing all of that sort of thing, as opposed to having no fence at any time the animals are not there as an alternative. So there's a few different ways that people are, because of the change of fencing technology and the power of portable energizers and all of this stuff, that people are, that's probably where there's the greatest innovation, you might say, in the fencing systems that people are doing. And then that comes down to where we were looking at before, or have looked at before, the types of fencing materials that people are using, which is our next point. And here using drill pipe, like we talked about last week, and the Kiwi Tech springs, and an amalgam of different materials, ceramic or polymer energizers, and different configurations there that people will use for different purposes. And then the layouts that you might put that in, as far as the topography, with McIver being probably one of the McIver farm of Jason Hagen, who's on the workplace, of being one of the most extreme fence designs that I've done, because there's a fence every 40 metres on a 200 hectare property, which who does that? Well, Jason did it because, and he was able to pay for, which is interesting. The capex, I think, of this property is around about, I think it was about $1,000 per hectare. So it was a fairly high capex as far as water and wire infrastructure. But then, because he's got a direct marketed, high revenue, highly profitable pastured pig operation, he was able to pay back that in about 18 months. So 18 months to 2 years, which is a really short payback period for an infrastructure capitalisation. So very, very good system that he's developed. So even a lot of work and a lot of infrastructure and a high amount of a dense amount of infrastructure for a broadacre property, able to pay back in a reasonable amount of time. So yeah, interesting. But a lot of fence, man. Bruce Davis, I just want to tie in some of this stuff, the work of people like Bruce Davison, who's also in the workplace, and he's got a company called Soil Smith, and really great agronomist, farmer agronomist, I would call him. But I really love showing some of Bruce's makeover fencing, where he's gone in and he's used, he's taken out fences which are existing to reconfigure the layout. And the game here has been to use these fencing materials in ways that if you go down to your local fencing supplier, they will never tell you to do end assemblies like this. They won't even know that that's possible, that it's possible. So here Bruce has put two T-posts. You can do this in the US with your T-posts, or Mexico with your T-posts, wherever you got them. Two steel posts that have been bonded together with a bit of wire. Interestingly, you might notice some of these subtleties, but see how, particularly with this post, see how that's under a bit of tension. So he's purposely put the posts in on a bit of angle, and then he's tightened them together. Now, steel under compression or under tension becomes a lot stronger. And I'll show you some subsequent posts which highlight that. So he's done that and then wired those together. So they're actually bound together with tension by this wire with good fence knots. And then he's put these braces in, which have just been wired in. And modern wire is super strong. Modern high tensile wire is really, really strong stuff. And if you use the right knots and do it in the right way, this is a very, very strong end assembly, and cheap, because it's all it's basically just labour, because you've already bought these posts, and they're probably 30 years old. Now you can't quite see it here, but the other thing that he's done here, it might be on this one here, illustrates it quite well. So you can see he's put these two posts under tension. He's then put this in the ground, and then he's purposely bent it over. And again, that curve it's genius, because that curve makes this whole thing so much stronger. It's strong when you just do a triangle, but when you put a bit of tension into that, there's a lot of that curve is holding a lot of energy, and so now if that fence was just on if that stay was just on a diagonal, then it wouldn't be anywhere near as strong as it is now, where there's a lot of, obviously, a lot of force underground, which is going this way. So as that post goes under, there's force going this way. But then there's also a lot of contained energy that's held up in this curve here, which is resistant to the pull that this strain is having. And so, but even with that, and then you've got a bit of wire that goes around here with a nice little knot and so on, ceramic insulator, good knot craft, and now you've got a very, very cheap end assembly, which is great. So the other part to this, which going back, is that Bruce has also used trampoline springs. So that there is a trampoline spring, which is a gate, and he's fitted over that a piece of waste PVC piping. On another one here, I think he's used a bit of same system with a bit of poly piping. But the biggest thing, probably one of the bigger points here is the spacing between the posts themselves. They're very widely spaced, and they're not at a space that is what comes out of the catalogue. And that's another part to this, where we're looking at putting posts at spacings. There's a question there from Alex. What soil types would the steel end assemblies suit? Look, Alex, I think, Bruce is he's on the south coast of New South Wales, so he's probably on granites, I would say. So they're obviously, and granites are usually a sandy loam soil texture, at least for the first 8 to 12 inches usually, and then they go to some form of clay. So they've got clay in the clay fraction, but they're described as sandy. They're quite coarse sandy loams. You being where you are at Kyneton, I think it would work. You'd probably, you might look at going with a slightly deeper post, a longer post, because of the reactive clay soils that you have. But it'd be interesting to try, and I think at least if you were looking at doing some fast temporary systems, fast subdivision systems down there, I think that would be worth having a crack at, definitely. I mean, if you put timber posts in, timber posts don't necessarily work well in highly reactive soil types either. I mean, those soil types, there's floaters in them, and they're called floaters. They're basaltic boulders, some of which are the size of a bus, or at least a combi wagon. They actually move up and down the soil profile with the shrinking and swelling. That's why they're called floaters. So I was talking with my cousin on Sunday, who's working on the Westgate Tunnel project, and it's his daily bread is working with floaters, because all of that area of Melbourne is all basaltic and full of floaters, red volcanic soil with these huge floaters. When they're drilling, the floaters just drop in, because whenever they find the path of least resistance, then that displacement goes in. And you see that with posts, that when you put a post in, no matter how you tamp it and all the rest of it, you can still get those posts moving. So, yeah, interesting to try and have a look at there, Alex. So, yeah. But the great thing about this is, as well as the low cost of the materials, is and the reuse of different materials as well, like trampoline springs, which are, you go to any landfill or recycling yard and there's always old trampolines and very cheap springs, versus buying one of those ones that you can buy. Excuse me. The other great thing is the very wide post spacing. I think Tom Bradman's got the record for me. He uses Kiwi Tech. I think he's out to 45 metres or something with his Kiwi Tech. What's the purpose of the post? It's to keep the wire off the ground. how wide, you know, if you're not having super high tension in your wires, then you don't need the spec on the end assemblies as much. And if you're using sprung fence systems, then you're going to be driving over them anyway. So yeah. Anyway, there's a few reasons why we would go down that pathway of trying to minimise, apart from the cost, trying to minimise the number of posts that we have and widening out their spacing as wide as possible. Kiwi Tech, obviously I've spoken about Kiwi Tech a number of times, and Laura Weir is on the workplace, and she's really kind, generous soul, and her family are great. And they've produced really great products, I think world leading, quality-wise and ingenuity, definitely. So they are a product that that's out there. So I'm going well today. There's a little bit of wind out there, and that dust is coming in, I think. Harry Weir has innovated all of these different apparatus to enable his techno-grazing program to be actualized by having all of this fencing infrastructure, which largely is temporary. And so that's all fantastic. And like I said, there's videos of people who have yeah, I'll just get to that in a moment. No, I lost my thought then, sorry. Jeff and Michelle, we've found the Kiwi Tech end assemblies do break frequently. I'll be curious to see Tom's setup. Tom uses star pickets. He uses a very similar setup to what has been done here. So, so when you're looking at end assemblies, there's the end assembly for the temporary fencing, which is basically what we've got here, where you've got a perimeter fence and then you set up the temporary fence. So depending on how you set that up, I don't know that that's what you're referring to. But then there's also, well, Tom, what he's using is star pickets as described here, Jeff or Michelle. So I forgot my point there, but anyway, let's move along as we go along. So I've got photos and videos of this as well, but one of the values of the Kiwi Tech system is the ability for you to drive over the fence, which is the first few times you see it, it's a bit unbelievable to see, especially if it's done at speed. Tom Bradman, I saw him come down at about, I don't know, he was going as fast as he could, unfortunately, on a four-wheeler like this, and just come, and you could just see him sliced into 3 pieces. That fortunately didn't happen, but so it makes the system so much more flexible when, instead of you having to, I mean, everyone knows, if you're a livestock operator, if you look at the volume of time that you get out of off and on your vehicle and open and close gates, and the deep sigh that usually happens before and after, and all of the different devices that people have developed, of course, to do that, whether it's cattle, everything from cattle grids, which are very expensive, right through to different, pushing devices and cantilever devices and all the rest of it, versus this system, which is where you just literally drive over the fence itself. And that's not a problem, which is super handy if you need to get it, if you're mustering, for example, or for whatever operation. If you're moving buildings, you're just moving around, you can just simply not have to go to the gate, just drive over the fence or push the fence down and move animals and so on, which are things that people do. I also wanted to look at alternatives to these materials, so it's not just a Kiwi Tech show. And so Polyface Farm, for example, and a lot of people use deformed metal bar, which I'll just zoom in on so you can see what I'm talking about there, the old rebar. And as you can see on this, it's able to take a fair bit of treatment. So the usual kit that people use at Polyface Farm, and the other tool here is the what's called the multi-rod, the multi-rod insulator. So that's an adjustable insulator. There's a number of companies that make them. There's a lot of variations on them. Some people you can get like a little insulated wire spring insulator which goes onto there, which you can clasp onto and move up and down. So you can change the height of the wire that you're fixing. I actually prefer those. I think they're probably going to last longer than these do. These do last quite a while, but they're a lot of plastic. They're recyclable, which is good. But there's basically an aperture which you push over, and the aperture has got a thread cut into it. And then this is a dial, which then once you push it over the rod, then you turn the dial. So it's a two-piece system, and very easy to just undo the dial and move the fence wire with the wire attached to whatever height you want. And you can do that with multiples of these if you wish. So that's a cheap and easy way of doing this. So at Polyface, when people go out and move the fencing, this is what they use for everything. They use the exact setup for all of their livestock operations. Because it's cheap, you put a point, just sit on the grinder, and grind a point in, and then you just drive that in. Because of the ribbing, it holds in pretty well. Because it's steel and 1/2 inch thick, 12 mil, it's not light, but it's heavy enough that even if you've got relatively stony ground, you can still belt into it. And so the kit that they carry is usually a set of the Leatherman wire cutters, which I can't remember what they're called, but they've got a set of pliers. So most of the apprentices or interns or the Saltertons will have one of them on their belt, as well as a normal pocket knife, and a little 2-pound hammer, which they'll slip into the back of their pants or on the bike if they're out. But when they're walking, that's what they'll carry a bundle of these under their arm, and then go and belt these in with a hammer. And so, goodness knows how many times this has been used, but that's what they use. And that, in this case, that's an aluminium wire, about 2.5 millimeter, so quite thick, and that's very visible. It never dulls. That's one of the good things about aluminium wire as well, is that it doesn't rust. It oxidizes gently, but it's highly visible to animals, which is great. And added to that is that when one does all of that kind of fencing, that if you're going to have a so-called flird, as I've got a photo of here, where you've got a flock of sheep mixed in with a herd of cattle, which is always an ideal thing, and we'll talk more about that when we come back and do the soils thing, where you've got mixed species grazing. Well, then you need mixed species fencing to go with that, and so on. I wanted to look at other temporary systems that we've devised. This is why I get Georgie to do things, because this is my sort of digital illustrations, which I suppose do the job of explaining things, but let's just say a rudimentary in their skill and their art. So here we're using this is at a project in Andalusia in Spain, and they had a whole oak forest which was being stocked with different forms of livestock, particularly cattle and sheep. And I said to them, look, we really need to get, and we wanted to do the grazing plan, and the challenge up there was how we were going to fence it and have it so that we could still, because that's mainly a horse property, and still being able to ride through there and do all of the rest of it. So I said, well, why don't we set it up so that we use some nylon rope around trees, which was Joel Selton's idea, or he was the first person I heard it from. And we'll set up a portable energizer and portable trough with a water trough, just off a trailer, and we'll graze that way. And so that's what they do. And other clients of ours have done the same. This is what they do at Polyface with their pig systems. Portable energizer, ground rod, which in itself is just a steel rebar post, which is occasionally used as a fence post as well. There's the water pipe. It's out in the forest, nylon rope around a tree, which doesn't bother the tree, a couple of ceramic insulators, powerful energizer, powerful battery, aluminium, high resistance wire, and now you've got a pig fence, right? And now you've got a silvipastoral system in the making. You know, that's the sort of thing, you know, when we've talked to Tom Rasmanis, when we're talking about your forest systems and a few others, you can, you know, there's not a big excuse as to why you can't do that when you look at some of the infrastructure. This is at Taranaki Farm years ago. We took on this and we started fencing off cattle and sheep in the forest because we were looking at it going, well, actually, there's quite a lot of grass growing in the forest. Well, let's eat it, and it's just going to be a fire risk, and that's a highly flammable area. So we just started using the trees, pop a bit of, this is telecom, nylon or Telstra cord, and we've just popped that around and then put a temporary fence up. I mean, it's pretty damn easy, and you've got a fence. As long as the animals, this is the biggest thing that I suppose Harry Weir kept talking about. The term he used was conditioning. You got to keep animals conditioned to that, and part of that is the kind of wire that you use. Energizers that you use, and that's been one of the big leap forwards in electric fencing is the strength of the energizers, especially the AC, AC/DC energizers that are available now, and also the declining cost of things like solar panels. So this is a home-built system that Jason Hagan built, and I think I've shared that with a few people, including Michelle McManus, who's I think on the call this morning. And here you have just a very simple rudimentary frame. You know, what angle do you do at? Always do your angle of your solar panels at the angle of your latitude, right? That's a very simple thing to learn. So that's that angle. And you just face it towards the sun. Obviously, it's not a tracking system, so you'll just basically face it north or south, depending on your hemisphere. And you've got your energizer, which has got a nice, specially built piece of steel over the top to keep the weather off it, and a little portable battery. And away you go. So that's a very powerful energizer. In fact, this one I think is enough for about 28 or 30 kilometres of fence, but it's only putting energy into about 3 kilometres of fence. And so, of course, because it's a bit overpowered, it's like having an overpowered pump. In this case, it's not as bad because the overpowering, because of all the dynamics of electricity, means that there'll just be more respect for the fence because it'll have more. It's got the same voltage, but the flow rate is a lot stronger. So yeah, there's a lot of respect for this. And a pig is basically like us as well. A lot more hair than I have, but if I go and touch an electric fence with any part of my body, I'm feeling it. So as a pig, they're super sensitive to electric fencing. Yeah, sheep are the least, because especially merinos or crossbreds. So because they're basically a walking insulator. They only discover an electric fence once that's all been shorn off, and even then. So you want to go a bit heavier? Well, go a bit heavier. So this is another one that Jason did. This is a 120 joule energizer, which he's using for some of the sow areas and whatnot, or where he's just for various reasons. He's built this into a bigger frame, and the frame fits into, guess what, the forks of his tractor. So he's able to come in with the forks and lift this up as he is with all of his buildings. So you sort of get the picture with all of this, and that's the story anyway. But then there's other energizers that we saw. These ones in California that we saw, which were really cool, using the solid wheel hand trolleys, which are $20 at those cheap stores, or $30. A solar panel, a regulator, and a battery on the bottom there, and with the solar panel providing the protection for the energizer. And then how you've got a really portable electric fence system, yet another configuration. Anyway, there's a few different ideas there. All right, books on the topic. There's a few resources here, 2 pages today. The Art and Science of Shepherding, which we haven't talked about apart from in reference, and not something I have a lot of experience with. I really enjoy when I'm in Europe, particularly in Spain, and particularly in places like Mallorca. There's a strong tradition of shepherdry in Mallorca still, and it's always beautiful to see. And the whole the whole landscape with all of the stone fences and the tight little laneways, which are the streets and roads, rural roads, are all set up to support shepherds. So a lot of people don't own their own animals. They grow cereals and they grow hay and they grow vegetables and all the rest of it, but there's shepherds who come in and do the job of cleaning up residues and doing all of that sort of stuff, which is really great, and the landscape set up for it. So, but yeah, something I'd probably in my life like to get a bit more about, but that's the book. Fred in the English-speaking world, at least, Fred Provenza is probably the guy, and I don't know Michelle Moreau, but I'm sure all of that's really great because Fred Provenza is a genius as far as all of that's concerned. The Condon Group, who I remembered, who I recalled before, or mentioned before, they have produced a number of reports and books. They're based in Western Australia. Wires and Pliers is an oldie bit of goodie. I don't think it's available anymore. It's certainly not in print on their website. They've replaced that with Fencing Fundamentals. I prefer this. This is an updated version, but it doesn't have I think it doesn't have the breadth of material that Wires and Pliers has, but nonetheless. And then they have a series of research reports which are only really available to subscribers or members. That's something we've discussed with them periodically, doing some sort of group membership deal with them. But that's all good stuff. The New South Wales government has some downloadable materials as well for electric fencing and hardwire fencing and whatnot. And then you come down to the companies, and the companies, there's that geo clip I was mentioning before as an alternative. So you've got these elongated holes in this little bit of wire, which you just clip in. They're not as fast as ClipX, but not that much slower, but another part to buy. So the fencing companies with their manuals are certainly worth reading. They're, obviously conservative, you might say, but also a little bit in favour of selling their product. But they're decent to read, and they also give you some idea of what the range of products are and so on. So there's a number of YouTube channels which are out there. Kiwi Tech have one, and Kiwi Tech, they've got a whole list of videos, but they also there's some really cool stuff in there. They also have some different playlists, which there was one guy there. Where is he? Oh, this guy here in Lands Tech is another one worth looking at. So look at those playlists for all of the explanations about how that whole package of stuff is used. And then we have, then there's a variety of other channels which I subscribe to, which I like. I don't mind doing fencing. I enjoy it, and it's interesting to me as a set of tools and skills. That's a bit of nostalgia there. I did a lot as a young fellow with my grandfather, so there's a bit of that in there. I still like digging holes and tamping holes. I like getting blisters on my hands and stuff from using a bar and that sort of thing. It takes me back. And I've been doing a bit of that lately, and it's good to get through the blister phase, and then the blisters become your calluses and your wear points, and that's when it's all good. No need to wear gloves like a lot of people do. You just got to get through the first bit of pain. So there's that. There's the ClipX, of course, have got some stuff, and there's a few others that are out there. I was looking for another one this morning, which I thought I'd subscribe to, but I couldn't. And they have a lot on knots and all of that sort of thing, and their different strategies on different fencing knots, which leads me to the task work for this week. I'm a little behind because I had Friday off, or half of Friday off, so I only got through half of what I was meant to yesterday. I usually catch up on Mondays, but I wasn't able to because there was so much in. So today is another day. Anyway, so the assessments this week are where we're looking at, your existing fencing, where it is. Ideally, a lot of that would have been marked way back when we were looking at our feature planning and putting all of our infrastructure on the original feature map way back when we did that. But, you know, take another look at it and look at its placement and its condition and its future, based on some of the discussions that we've had today. And with that, the opportunities for retrofitting, replacement and development. And then you look at, of course, your Google Earth Pro mapping layer and the annotation of that. And this is where, you know, if you haven't already, you might look at, you know, your existing fencing layout and measuring the areas and start to annotate each paddock and so on. And I did mention a few times, I think now, that one of the strategies we do for that is to create a folder for each. Once you kind of do it, it's kind of almost has to happen in reverse, where you go and do a polygon for every parcel, which I'll usually mark that as a red color, or usually a red color. I'll use a thick, maybe a 3-point red line style for a perimeter fence, but then I might use for subdivision either a change in hue of red or just use a 2-point or a 1-point for that, so that it's clear that that's a different order of fencing or a different style of fencing. But I'll do that as a polygon, an unfilled polygon. Now, as you know, there's a limitation with Google Earth that when you do a polygon, you can't, like a lot of apps, you can then create a label for that, so that when you're looking at the farm map, you can easily identify that. You have to do that as an extra step, and that's where you use the place mark tool. And so what we will do, what we'll recommend that you do on that basis, if I just use here, if I'm going to build, if I'm in that fencing layer, and I'm doing my subdivision, so I'll go into there. What I'll do is I'll add a folder, and I'll call that, say, P1, right? So P1, I'll just do the folder. And then once I've done P1, and then I go mapping it, well, then I'll use my polygon tool, which I'll call P1 at this stage. And good, see, that's all nice, all ready to go. And then I'll mark that out. So let's say this is in Somaliland, so not likely, but anyway, we'll mark that out. And now that, because it was open in there, it goes in there. Now to label that, so one of the things I'll do now is I'll stick on that and I'll get the get info, and I'll go to measurements, and it will tell me that that's 4.43 hectares. So I'll usually pop that detail here. So I'll go 4.4 hectares. HA. And so that's marked, but then to mark it so I can see it on the screen, I'll go to my place mark tool, and I'll usually find something else. I like to use something like this one here. I'll make it small so it's not big, and I'll do that icon, and I'll go to style. I'll make sure that text is a bit bigger than it is. So go that full size, and with that, I'll go P1 dash 4.4 hectares, right? And so that then becomes the label. That's a bit of a pain in the neck, but one of the things that because it's a few steps, but one of the things that I've discovered with that process is because you've got all of that stuff in one folder, now you can also put your management material in that folder, because you're going to come along next and say, if you do things properly, then you could come along now and you're going to go, let's say we'll go 2019, 1/2/10, right? So that's that day. And what we're going to do now is we're going to use, say, a orange line, and we're going to mark, we'll use that a bit smaller. We're going to mark out from our GPS input where today's fence went, right? Now, and then tomorrow, we're going to be out there again, and we're going to do another line, which is going to be 2019, 12, 11, and we're going to have another fence line, except this one, for whatever reason, was over here, was marked on our GPS, right? Now, from that then, you might have taken your photos and then you've got a photo point and so on. And then you can come back when you're doing that, and you may well then retrospectively go or remove that line altogether and convert that into a polygon, right, as an area, right? And then from that, you've then got your hectares of area, and then you can start to put into the description. You can add your local images, you can put into the description the number of animals that were in there, and now you're really starting to build within your Google Earth a whole lot of data, which you can then go and track back. So you might even end up with paddock 1 adding an additional folder, which might be 2019, right? And it might be 2019 growing season. It might be, or as people call it, open plan, or it might be closed plan, right? And so within each of these paddocks, you then over time are building up a repository of data which you can then use for future plans, but also for if you are involved in advocacy or education, you can use it as a record to show what you've done and how things have changed, because people are very interested in that. So that's another reason why I like to set up the folders. There's a bit of a pain in the neck part if you're just doing it to mark the system out, but then you can also do it with good reason because it can become a repository for all of your data storage. Okay, we've gone a bit over today, that's all right. Okay, well that's enough. So you can all get knotted now, and there's a lovely knot. I love taking photos of knots when they all work out. I don't take photos of my bad knots, so but the figure 8, what a lovely looking knot that is. So with that, I'll leave it with you and let you enjoy your day, unless anyone's got any exceptionally pressing questions, because we are a bit over time. But otherwise, I'm going to kick on. So if you've got a question, quickly pop your hand up. Otherwise, we'll close the meeting down. I'll just see on the workplace if anyone's got anything there. I'm just going to see if there's any comments or anything. Okay, doesn't appear so. No. Okay. No questions from any of you. All right. Have a lovely day. Enjoy it. And we'll catch up with you all very, very soon. Have a good day. Bye.